Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for Small But Mighty, how WCK's locally led strategy helps feed the world. I'm Tunde Wackman, Chief Development Officer here at WCK. I'm so delighted to be with you today. And before we dive in, I wanted to take a moment to thank everyone who submitted questions. We've received a lot of them, and some clear themes emerged that will guide our conversation around how WCK leverage its modest size to make mighty impact around the world. And while the scale of our emergency responses can be tremendous, our team is actually quite small. You may be surprised to learn that we only have about 100 employees here at WCK. But as Chef José always likes to say, everyone is a part of WCK. They may just not know it yet. So welcome to our community. We're so delighted to have everyone here. Our unique ability to quickly respond to disasters and to scale our operations is possible in huge part because of our belief that local communities are our superpower. Our size is an asset that allows communities to lead the way in their own post-disaster recovery. Here to share much more about our approach are my wonderful colleagues from our relief team. Dan Abrams, Senior Manager of Relief Operations, who's coming to us live from Cairo today. It's his evening time, and we're so delighted for you to be here. And Fiona Donovan, Director of Relief Operations. Dan, Fiona, thank you so much for being here today. First, can each of you briefly introduce yourselves and how you came to WCK and some of your most memorable emergency responses?
Hi, everyone. It's so great to be here with you today. My name is Fiona Donovan, and I'm the Director of Relief Operations at World Central Kitchen. I started my journey at WCK after Hurricane Dorian hit the Bahamas in 2019. And like so many of our current staff, began as a volunteer making sandwiches and chopping onions in our kitchen in Nassau for those impacted by the Category 5 hurricane. I was quickly drawn to WCK's response model, how quickly and effectively the team was able to get meals into the hands of people who needed them the most. And I ended up staying in the Bahamas for several months. I really loved the work and the impact and the people that I was fortunate enough to work alongside, and ended up going from the Bahamas to Puerto Rico for an earthquake response, and then to Matamoros, Mexico, in response to a humanitarian crisis at the border. The response in Mexico is still one of the most meaningful and memorable to me after almost 5 years at WCK. 3,000 asylum seekers were residing in an encampment at the border who had made long and treacherous journeys to the US in search of a better life. WCK set up a comedor and served the community dinner every single night at the camp. And for many, this was the very first time that families had the opportunity to sit at a table together to enjoy a nourishing meal and to feel some semblance of routine and normalcy despite their very difficult circumstances. So I spent a few months serving in the camp and really deeply felt the power that a hot plate of food had in bringing comfort and love to people during some of the hardest days of their lives.
Amazing.
And hi, everyone. My name is Dan Abrams, and I am the Senior Manager for Relief Operations. Like Fiona, I started at WCK as a volunteer in the Bahamas. Before that, I worked at DC Central Kitchen, which has a long-standing relationship with WCK. And I actually have an interesting background that oddly includes federal emergency responses and food. So in some ways, it makes a lot of sense that this is where I've ended up. The most impactful response for me was our work in Poland after the Russian invasion. It was here that we expanded serving a meal with dignity to include creating a dignified environment for our recipients to enjoy those meals. Instead of serving them from a table in a pop-up tent to people in line, I had an opportunity to create warm and inviting spaces for people to rest for a minute and enjoy the meal we created before they head on their way, just like a regular restaurant. And we worked with IKEA and a local makeup company actually to furnish them with bistro tables and a proper serving counter. And I'll never forget heading to the Medica border, crossing from Ukraine to Poland with Fiona. A week or two into the response, we scooped hot stew for the flood of refugees coming through on the border on a card table we found lying by the side of the road. The desperation of our recipients was really clear, and I could really feel how special our meals were to them. Also, I grew up in upstate New York, but I have never in my whole life been colder than that night in Poland.
Oh my gosh, goosebumps. Thank you so much for both of you for sharing. Fiona, over to you. Can you provide an overview of the relief team and share some insight into how you coordinate and execute WCK's rapid response efforts in various crisis situations?
There are so many elements that go into WCK being able to rapidly respond to disasters and humanitarian crises worldwide. And we are always striving to hit a balance between having enough structure, systems, and processes in place to allow us to mobilize efficiently, yet still remaining nimble and agile so we can adjust and improvise those systems to meet the unique needs on the ground. Though flexibility is key, we also know that we need a really strong foundation to get us started. So overall, the relief team has key departments, we call them relief units, that we mobilize on every response. Our emergency response team monitors disasters and then makes the recommendation for WCK to activate. They're often the very first boots on the ground when we decide to go. Then we have our activation manager who oversees the entire response, and our community outreach unit that conducts needs assessments and finds the communities that are most in need of our support. The distribution unit is responsible for managing meal deliveries, tracking our data and locations, and overseeing all of our various feeding modalities like restaurant meals, WCK kitchen meals, or food kits, which we'll get into a little bit more later. Then we have the procurement and logistics unit that handles tasks like our purchasing, our supply chain logistics, and all the technical components that go into building field kitchens, often with little to no infrastructure in place. They find us propane, install our water systems, and make sure that we have warehousing space and vehicles. Then lastly, and certainly not least, we have our culinary unit, which are our chefs. Not only do our chefs cook our meals, but they also ensure that all the meals that we're preparing are culturally appropriate and align with what's familiar to the communities that we serve. An important part of the culinary unit is what we call the culinary support team. They make sure that food is served at temperature and that raw ingredients that we procure are good quality, and ultimately that all meals are served safely and with dignity. So these 5 pillars of our relief team lay the groundwork for every WCK response, but then we have many other departments that work on the ground or remotely to sustain these operations, such as our field finance team that handles cash and payments, our tech team that makes sure that we can communicate with each other when comms are down, or our volunteer team that will leverage our local network to bring on needed human resources. Really, everywhere we go, the WCK model is to activate a small core team of staff and response corps members, and then as quickly as possible, connect and learn from local community members who join our team and point us in the right direction. So we really serve as trainers and capacity builders who take direction from the local populations that we meet. I'll never forget when Dan and I arrived in Turkey less than 48 hours after the earthquake last year. We'd been connected to just a couple of translators remotely to get started on emergency feeding while we traveled. And then by the time we landed in Adana, there were 30 people in our conference room calling restaurants, connecting with local officials, and sharing NGO and volunteer groups who were already cooking and needed our support. It was absolutely incredible. And this workforce eventually grew to include over 300 people. So we're often asked how we find people and how we identify needs. And the reality is that most of the time people find us. Word travels on social media and through word of mouth. And in this really organic way, our network expands from the ground up. So this is why we don't go into any response with a completely set playbook for exactly what we're going to do or how we're going to do it. We listen and we learn and adapt so that our work always meets the needs where they are.
Amazing. We are in constant awe in the development department, but I know the rest of the organization shares that sentiment too. Every single activation is a carefully crafted logistical dance. And so you all now see behind the curtain of what all goes into this. So thank you for going through that and explaining it to us, Fiona. Dan, how's the process in which we deploy different from the early days of WCK? Can you share a little more about that?
Yeah, before our current structure, we would gather a group of people and send them to a location. Once there, our managers would assign people roles based on the unique needs of the activation. And we felt that that could really get disorganized. We didn't always have the right people in the right jobs or clarity around specific roles. For example, I remember being in Louisiana after Hurricane Laura, and I was stationed at the loading dock at the casino we were cooking out of to organize getting our meals out into the delivery vehicles. This type of role, getting meals to their recipients, comes up at every activation, but we didn't have a name for it. And it was often so specific, standing at the loading dock, that it felt like a new role every time. After this activation, we decided we needed to create roles and responsibilities with enough of a general overview that people had a sense of what they were doing before they even arrived on the ground. This led to the creation of the first roles and responsibilities doc and an org chart with the departments and the teams that Fiona mentioned earlier. We first tried it out in Hurricane Ida in the fall of 2021 in New Orleans. The role I served in the loading dock back in Hurricane Laura is the expediter, which is part of what we now call the distribution team, and it exists on every single activation. The structure we built creates a framework so that we can create systems for situations that won't change. For example, we pay restaurants the same way no matter where we are, while still remaining nimble and adaptable based on every activation.
Amazing. Love to hear about the evolution. Thank you so much for sharing. Question for both of you. Speaking of Response Corps, can you discuss the role of this group in our deployment strategy and how we mobilize these individuals to ensure rapid and effective assistance on the ground?
Response Corps plays a really critical role in allowing WCK to activate rapidly and be responding to multiple events in different places at one time. The Response Corps is composed of individuals who we've met and worked with in the field all over the world, who learn how to perform the various roles within the units that we've described, and who return to work with us activation after activation globally. Over the years, this network has grown to include hundreds of skilled, cross-trained team members who have a drive and a passion for showing up to serve. As WCK has responded in more and more places over the years, our Response Corps network has grown to include folks from New Orleans to Poland and Ukraine to Morocco to Guatemala, all with diverse backgrounds and field experiences, different language skills, and highly valuable local connections. So when we decide to respond somewhere, the first thing we do is think of which Response Corps members are located locally or regionally. And then we mobilize these teams so that we can get on the ground quickly and have team members who are most familiar with the local landscape. We also consider which folks are best suited for specific unit roles, like cooking on a food truck or managing a warehouse or conducting really remote field assessments, so that we're building teams with the right specializations and have those clear roles and responsibilities. Thinking back to our work in Poland, we ran a field kitchen at the border for over 6 months and had hundreds of people volunteer to join our mission. Many of those people, some of whom fled Ukraine at the beginning of the war, are now integral members of our Response Corps. And in fact, many of them have been working in Cairo to support our massive response in Gaza. So the Response Corps really gains this experience on the WCK way of doing things from each activation that they're on, and then they bring those lessons learned to the next activation in a way that's really highly effective.
And often Response Corps are members of the communities where they have repeat responses. One, Whitney, actually lives in Nashville and serves as our eyes and ears on the ground in that part of the country. She'll always let us know if there are things happening over there and will respond within hours of an event nearby. Just like tornadoes in Tennessee that happened right before Christmas last year. With all of her local connections, she was able to build a Christmas-themed distribution event in about 3 days. And we also have Monica in South Florida, who has worked with us since 2019, and she's built her own network of food trucks over the years. And in January, a tornado touched down in Panama City Beach, and she organized local food trucks to pass out food as soon as it hit.
Wow. The power of our service corps in action. I love it. And this brings me to my next question, which is the number one question that we always receive in development from our wonderful WCK community is, how can I volunteer? If I had a nickel, I would be a very, very rich woman. So over to you both to answer the question.
Yeah, we welcome everyone to join the WCK Volunteer Corps. We're always looking for more people all over the world. And as a disaster relief organization, our volunteer needs fluctuate with each response effort. So we can't predict when or where we'll need your help. But once you're a member of the WCK Volunteer Corps, we will be able to reach you in an area where we're responding when you're needed.
Awesome, thank you. So let's talk about establishing local partnerships. You said that hiring people locally is key to any operation. What are some other ways that we work hand in hand with local partners? Dan, perhaps you can take this one. Can you describe the process of building these sustainable solutions on the ground?
Yeah, I think a good example will be here. I'm leading the Gaza activation from Cairo, and it's been a challenging project that we've really leaned on our local partners to make this work possible. We were able to get started so quickly last fall by activating an organization that works in the region named ANERA, and they're a partner we've worked with previously. And with financial support to feed on our behalf, they were able to get started right away. They had the supply connections and the staff, but our support allowed them to get the product and logistics and create the very first meals that we sent out. And just from there, we grew and grew and grew. To expand, we partnered with more than 20 organizations that were cooking to some degree, but all needed just a little bit of help to scale. So we delivered them stoves and fuel, and we got them regular supplies of food so they could grow from a couple hundred meals to, in some cases, thousands each day. And we've also built what we now call community kitchens. And when our community outreach teams go out and identify hyper-local community leaders who have a desire to cook, they just need food and a space to set up, we'll set them up to do so with our supplies. We now have 85 of these around Gaza, cooking alongside our 3 main field kitchens and our partner organizations. And all of this work has allowed us to find creative ways to solve issues as they arise. Just yesterday, we were able to deliver our first pallets of food from Jordan to North Gaza, which is one of the hardest areas of famine in all of Gaza. We don't have staff in the north due to safety concerns, but there are a number of organizations who do. And through these partnerships, we delivered them pallets, which they themselves then distribute quickly to the 80 to 100,000 Palestinians who are still in the region and desperately need food. We wouldn't be able to do that without these partners. And this massive undertaking has employed over 400 people. It's Palestinians feeding Palestinians, which is always our goal, locals feeding locals. They're the ones with the connections that to the community, and they want to support their neighbors, and we're happy to make that happen. We are also happy to share today that we opened Zami's Kitchen, an all women-led kitchen built entirely by our local Palestinian team in Khan Yunis, named after our colleague Zami, who was killed by the IDF in April. Today, we served 1,000 meals to the surrounding community, and we're excited to really see it grow.
Incredible.
In addition to our current work in Gaza, there are several other recent activations that come to mind that really highlight how we engage in local partnerships to execute our work. As we've mentioned, our local contacts and partnerships really drive our feeding strategy and bring that valuable insight and knowledge to the table that's critical to how we operate. For example, in response to the flooding in Brazil last month, our ground team partnered with a local NGO called Feed Me that was already cooking and serving their community when our team landed on the ground. WCK helped them to build up their capacity and expand into a larger kitchen space. We invested in infrastructure and cooking equipment to grow their operation and provided financial support so that our teams could work hand in hand to cook over 17,000 meals a day out of our field kitchen. Their local chefs taught us about the cuisine, and their field teams showed us where the most forgotten communities were located so we could be sure to fill those gaps. Our community outreach team was fully embedded with the local population and learned of remote, isolated Indigenous communities that were not yet receiving support. And our team learned that cooking was extremely important culturally in these communities. So rather than delivering them hot meals, we provided wood and cassava flour and other familiar ingredients so that people could cook for themselves in a way that was appropriate for them. Right now, we also have a team in New Mexico responding to the fires. And on our first day there, the team quickly found a group of volunteers who were supporting the elderly populations that had evacuated to hotels in nearby towns. We worked alongside these volunteers to provide meals, and they were able to handle that last mile delivery of food door to door to these families. By partnering with local groups like this, we're also working smarter, not harder. We don't need to reinvent the wheel on distribution and can instead tap into the existing local networks to support them with their work. And the last example I'll give is from the tornadoes in Kentucky, where WCK created this really unique partnership with the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife. They had ATVs and the local knowledge of where people lived and how to get up these difficult streets called hollows, which are not identifiable on any map. So by partnering with them, this enabled us to reach communities that we never would have been able to otherwise.
Amazing. When assessing the needs of a community, how does WCK determine whether to provide meal kits or hot meals or set up kitchens? Can you walk us through this decision-making process?
Before COVID, we primarily had one modality, setting up 1 or 2 central kitchens to cook from and distribute to recipients from there. But when COVID hit, we had to be in many places at once. And this is when the restaurant feeding model really took off and allowed us to expand and test different options. We determine a modality based on the needs of our recipients and the environment we're in. A stationary and complex single kitchen, for example, would not make the most sense in every crisis. Like for feeding migrants, for example, they are constantly on the move. So maybe a food truck that can be set up and taken down quickly would be more logical, for example. But in a hurricane, a couple stationary kitchens would make more sense as the population tends to be stationary. Food kits come in handy when people can cook at home, which is overwhelmingly what we hear from recipients and what they want to do. But they don't always have the supplies to do so. So the kits are usually made of produce locally when possible and pantry items. And when we also use these when we are winding down emergency feeding and we want to welcome people back to their homes where their food has perhaps spoiled. So we provide them with a food box so they don't have to go out grocery shopping right away. And actually in Gaza, we delivered a box that has ingredients specifically special for Ramadan. And we've explored even more creative ways to provide food to people, like when we set up free farmers markets in Kentucky after the floods in 2021, where the entire community could shop at a local Kentucky produce for free for a month after the floods. We paid for the produce and also gave residents agency to choose the food that they wanted to bring home for themselves and their families. And it also, of course, reinvigorated the local economy, which is always a great bonus.
And I'll add that even with all of these kind of more foreseen feeding modalities, the relief team is still always finding new and innovative ways to provide food assistance depending on the context. So for example, last winter, Hurricane Otis hit Mexico as a Category 5 hurricane, and the impacts were really severe. So we set up a field kitchen, we partnered with restaurants, we delivered food kits and implemented all of our more standard feeding modalities. But we also branched out with new response models to best support this specific population. So after the hurricane, the price of tortillas, a critical staple food in Mexico, skyrocketed because there was a limited supply of maseca, corn flour, in the impacted region, and truck drivers had stopped deliveries given the impacts. So to reactivate the supply chain, we delivered hundreds of tons of maseca to support the tortillerias so they could reopen their businesses. And WCK asked those vendors to price their tortillas as they were prior to the hurricane, since we were providing the product. This project enabled them to reopen their shops and put their employees back to work, and all collectively increase access to food. Also in Mexico, the local fishing community was really heavily impacted by the storm. Fishermen's boats got damaged and they lost their nets, which was detrimental because fishing was their primary livelihood. And so WCK provided fishing equipment and materials so that they could fix their boats and they could resume business, feed themselves, and feed their families. So we're always testing these new response models because every response is so different and the needs of every community are so unique. Our really primary goal is to meet the needs as quickly and effectively as possible. And this includes building sustainable solutions to address food access issues and investing in local businesses so they are eventually able to return to normal.
Incredible, thank you. And talk to us about how WCK selects and collaborates with restaurant partners, and what are those criteria that you are considering in establishing these partnerships?
Honestly, it can be as scrappy as Googling restaurants on Facebook or an Instagram message people at first. I'll never forget sitting on my couch in DC and shooting off hundreds of Facebook messages in Google translated German to strangers who ran restaurants and food trucks in Germany after the floods hit. You would be surprised how often that actually really works. When we identify restaurants, we aren't just looking for food. We want to make sure that the food is aligned with cultural preferences that are comforting and familiar to the people we're serving. Local chefs teach us about their menus, and we adapt our recipes and offerings to meet people where they're at. I loved when we were in Kentucky after the tornadoes, and we hired local school cafeteria staff to make scratch-made chicken and dumplings just the way that this specific town enjoyed to eat them. Food is really personal to people, so our chefs make sure that this is a top priority in the field. Many of our partnerships grow organically. Like in Poland, when one of our colleagues stumbled upon a couple of chefs handing out meals in a parking lot. We brought them together to talk about partnering, and they were excited to help, but said they could probably only do about 100 meals a day between them. With our team's culinary coaching and guidance, they were able to produce thousands of meals each by the end of the activation. And that team of restaurant partners are now some of our key Response Corps members. We look for partners who are excited to support the community. If they have the attitude and they can produce good meals, our culinary staff can help them scale using our standards and our guidance.
I'd also like to highlight WCK's Chef Corps and how powerful this network of chefs has been in helping us to forge connections on the ground globally and to identify restaurant partners and chefs to work with. The Chef Corps is a global network of more than 400 prominent culinary leaders who champion WCK and are uniquely positioned to accelerate and amplify the relief team's work when we first arrive on the ground. Our Chef Corps members serve as these local liaisons because chefs are among the most connected and trusted people in their communities. They also tend to thrive in chaos, much like the WCK team, and are resilient problem solvers who have a passion for service. So when a disaster strikes in their city or region, they plug us into their contacts and resources so we can get cooking as quickly as possible and best serve the local community. Every emergency is different, but we may be looking for kitchens, restaurant partners, volunteers, local suppliers, delivery vehicles, places to store our equipment, or just early eyes and ears on the ground to help us understand the situation and the impacts. The Chef Corps is particularly valuable in the first 24 hours of a response when our teams are traveling, and they'll find us sandwiches or hot meals so that as soon as we land, we can go straight to pick up food and immediately get out into the community to begin feeding. As a recent example, when deadly fires devastated Chile this year, Chef Corps member Fernanda Fuentes knew that she had to help. She's from Quilpué, one of several cities like Viña del Mar and Reñaca, most impacted by the blazes. And upon joining the World Central Kitchen team, Chef Fernanda immediately went out to find people most in need of nourishing meals because she was really familiar with the community. She also assisted with meal distribution and visited with many of our restaurant partners. Her local expertise was so invaluable. We've really learned that great people in our network know other great people who are eager to jump into any response and help. So these connections help us to build out our teams and our contacts so we can build a strong local response force.
Wow, you brought this to life so beautifully and just really demonstrated how our Chef Corps members and restaurant partners are really the heart and soul of their communities and such valuable members to our activations. Thank you. And final question, how have you witnessed the unique superpowers within communities in times of crisis? Dan, over to you first.
Yeah, I think after the earthquake in Japan, I really felt a resurgence of the importance of the respect during emergencies. We found some incredible partner restaurants who really embodied this. One of the partners actually showed up every single day in white chef coats and hats. And it was so clear that they wanted to be there, not just for the money, but for the community. They gave the residents the dignity of a well-prepared, but also well-presented experience. These small touches are what set our meals apart, and that care is ultimately what makes for a really great partnership. It was also here that we met Yuka, a local guide for reporters who joined us to work in Restaurant Partners in Kanazawa. She flourished and built successful partnerships that I think really needed that local touch to make our work possible.
Really, across the board on every response we've ever worked on, the individuals that we meet are our superpower. I'm thinking of adventure tour guide Max in Guatemala turned community outreach leader who's led helicopter assessments when there's no other way to access a community. And I'm thinking of Polish translator Barbara, a turned restaurant coordinator who scaled our feeding response across the country to serve hundreds of thousands of meals every day to Ukrainians fleeing the war. I'm thinking of food and beverage director Charlie in New Orleans, turned distribution manager, who's led kitchen expediting out of countless field kitchens in the Gulf during hurricane season. We have so many unique, incredible human beings in our orbit who bring their relevant skill sets to the table in such a valuable way. And people want a way to utilize their experiences for a greater good. And they're hungry to jump into action and help however they can. WCK is really just a facilitator that allows this to happen. Like you mentioned earlier, José Andrés always says that everyone is a part of WCK and they just don't know it yet. And we've seen that this sentiment really rings true because inherent in everyone is a desire to help a neighbor, to invest time and energy into something greater than themselves, and to bring comfort and hope to people through their hardest days. WCK is a force that really encourages this drive that already exists inside of people and then empowers and inspires them to be compassionate, to be selfless, to serve a hot plate of food, and to make other people's lives just a little bit brighter.
Amazing. Thank you both so much for being here today and for so generously sharing your stories from the field. I think these are just magic, and we're so grateful for everything that the relief team is doing to serve those in need and providing that hope, that comfort, and that dignity in times of crisis. Thank you. And thank you all for joining us today. As we gather here, our work on the ground continues, and whether that's in Haiti or Brazil or Gaza, New Mexico or Ukraine, Dan is going right back to it in Cairo. And if you're moved by what you've heard today and inspired and would like to support WCK's efforts, please consider making a donation. Your contribution allows our teams to remain flexible and adaptable in delivering aid where it's needed the most. To donate, simply visit wck.org/donate or scan the QR code on the screen. Thank you so much for your ongoing support of WCK and for believing in this work. We're grateful to have you. Take care.